Craving your next action-packed adventure? Audible delivers thrills of every kind on your command, like Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, where a lone astronaut must save humanity from extinction, narrated with stunning intensity by Ray Porter. From electrifying suspense and daring quest to spine-tingling horror and romance in far-off realms, unleash your adventurous side with gripping titles that'll keep you guessing. Discover exclusive Audible originals, hotly anticipated new releases, and must-listen bestsellers that hook you from the first minute. Because Audible knows there's no greater thrill than the one that speaks to you. Discover what lies beyond the edge of your seat. Start your free 30-day trial at audible.com/WonderyUS. That's audible.com/WonderyUS.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined today not by Brett because he and Mrs. Brett have just had baby number 3. We have so many good wishes to them, but don't worry, guys, because we have an incredible guest today. You are going to be riveted by everything she has to say. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by Dani Pinter, who is the Senior Legal Counsel at National Center on Sexual Exploitation. She is going to debunk a bunch of myths. She's going to teach us about what the profile of victims of sex trafficking, sexual exploitation look like. And she's talking about real life cases, including someone she represents in a very, very well publicized lawsuit right now. Dani, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Dani. Okay. You guys may not know this, but Dani has been doing the news junket because she is probably the most sought after person to talk about these issues, sexual exploitation and beyond. But she has devoted her life to this work. I know you've been in the news and we'll get to it later, but you have been embroiled in a lot of the investigations and the lawsuits against the Tate brothers, who have been charged with sex trafficking, among other very, very serious charges in Romania, and their investigations elsewhere. You represent a Jane Doe. So thank you for coming on in the midst of what I assume is an incredibly busy legal battle as well as a news cycle.
It sure is. It's probably one of the craziest experiences of my life. And I feel like in this work, we see a lot of crazy things, but I'm excited to dig into it with you.
Thanks, Dani. So before we get there, we cover a lot of cases of women going missing and vulnerable populations getting exploited in different manners throughout this podcast, as well as our other podcast, the Prosecutor's Podcast. But I think something that people don't quite understand is, what is the profile of a typical victim? And I know there is no typical victim who can be sexually exploited or trafficked. And I'll start just by saying this. Oftentimes we'll see a case of maybe a Caucasian college student who goes on vacation to the Bahamas or something, and they go missing. And the first thought everyone has is, oh my goodness, she was snatched up off the street and she's trafficked. And that who is being trafficked. While that may happen, I think not understanding what the profile of a victim is, it can only lead to more harm to vulnerable populations. So can you talk a little bit about the work that you do and who these victims are? And do we have kind of the wrong view of who these victims are?
That is such an important question. So I'm so glad you're asking it. Yeah, I think we do have not quite an accurate view of what a typical, and like you said, there really isn't a typical victim, but there's definitely patterns, very distinct patterns in the profile of someone who is sex trafficked. And the truth is that usually looks like someone with previous sexual history, almost always previous sexual abuse in their history, particularly child sexual abuse. Very often when this is child trafficking or minor trafficking, this is kids in foster care. These are young teens in foster care. That is almost, especially if we're talking about domestic sex trafficking, because there is also, I think, a misconception that when we talk about sex trafficking, we're only talking about people either trafficked out of the United States or trafficked into the United States via immigration, which of course there is human trafficking in those contexts, but we have a very serious domestic sex trafficking problem here in the United States. In every single city, there are people being sex trafficked, and often those are the young teenagers, like I said, in foster care, the runaways. It's those women and children who are vulnerable for one reason or another. That's who the trafficker seeks out. It would be a lot more difficult and a bigger battle and more likely to get caught to target, an affluent young adult or child who has a support system and a family. It's usually a troubled person with either drug issues or previous sexual abuse or even mental health issues. And these traffickers know how to spot that person who's vulnerable and looking for love or looking for something, even if it's like looking for a home, a safe place to stay. And that's who they traffic. So it's the person with vulnerabilities that gets targeted.
Thank you, Dani, for kind of showing us the profile of that. And we talk about this a lot on our show as well in terms of those vulnerable populations. And you've already begun to say this in explaining who these vulnerable populations are. It doesn't sound like trafficking is like a one-time, like someone gets snatched off the street and then boom, they're trafficked. It sounds like something much more gradual and maybe much more mind game related, psychological control than maybe even physical control. So can you kind of talk a little bit about the types of scenarios and how someone finds themselves in a pattern of being trafficked?
Yeah, there's absolutely a grooming period. And that's, to get to the heart of your question, it's not usually somebody walking down the street, minding their own business and getting kidnapped. There is usually a grooming period one way or the other. And if we're talking about, runaway kids or troubled kids, this is, an adult befriending them, offering them what they want, a place to stay, maybe free alcohol, drugs. Maybe it starts off just befriending them. We're your family now, creating a support system now that the child then gets enmeshed, right? This child is looking for a family, has no one. The trafficker provides that. And family dynamics get used all the time. This is your family now. And so you do what the family needs you to do. And you wouldn't betray your family. You wouldn't cross your family. And you should do anything for your family. Think of everything we've done for you. And so then it's becoming, you need to, participate in this prostitution, or, maybe it's even creating pornography or something like that. And that's really the same for adults who are sex trafficked. They're vulnerable one way or the other. It could be that they're just, not someone in a super desperate situation like they're living on the street. Could be a young woman who has just experienced a very difficult life, looking for love, and meets someone who makes her feel really, really special. What I hear over and over again from particularly adult women who've been trafficked is the trafficker, when they're talking about him, and often they aren't even saying the trafficker, right? They're saying, whoever this person is, John Doe, I never felt like that before. He made me feel more special than I've ever felt before. He made me feel seen. This was a once in a lifetime connection. I always hear something like that. That's what these traffickers do, is they create this bond. They create a situation where the victim has something now they've never had before that they want, whether that's a family, whether that's love, whether that's security, and create a situation where now they feel like they don't want to lose that. They don't want to lose that. And so there's this grooming of slowly introducing whatever it is the trafficker wants them to do. If it's prostitution or pornography, there's this just slowly breaking down of boundaries and tightening up and ratcheting up the dependency and the connection until next thing you know, it's unimaginable for the woman to say no to this person, even if there isn't violence. And usually there is some kind of violence or threats sort of subtly mixed in that she kind of becomes desensitized to slowly through the grooming process. But sometimes there isn't. And it's really just the desperate connection or the isolation. She has literally, I'll hear this all the time, there was nowhere else for me to go. Where was I going to go? What was I going to do? So that is really the pattern we see over and over again.
So when you say that there's a grooming process, how are these traffickers, and you're right, I think, in my experience, the victims, they can't even bring themselves to call the other person that because it's usually someone they love,
Right.
Probably they've never felt that loved in their lives before. But what kind of tools do they use to groom? Is it usually in person? Are we seeing it more prevalent now that the internet, is obviously very pervasive? How do you see what avenues of access are these groomers using?
So I want to talk about two different things. So I want to talk about the online, because the trends and the changes in how the grooming process can happen online is now, it's worthy of its own attention. But first, I'll just talk about sort of when it's in person. And we've seen this time and time again. I mean, we represent a young woman who is suing pornography companies because she was trafficked as a minor on there and, even reported it and they didn't take it down. And so, we believe Pornhub was well on notice that there was trafficking and that they weren't doing anything they should have been doing to not facilitate it. And in fact, we're actually actively encouraging it. But what, she experienced was very typical. And so I'll talk about her and really I want to talk about, it's a few people, but there's this breaking down of the boundaries. And so that's part of what the grooming process is. First, there's this love bombing, it's called, which is the showering the person with the affection and those special words and maybe even gifts or taking them on trips, doing all these things. And then slowly through either just the interpersonal sexual connection, slowly introducing more and more extreme sex acts, maybe introducing more sort of like violence. Then oftentimes there'll be an introduction of something like group sex or you should have sex with my friend or my buddy. Hey, why wouldn't you do that? Sort of desensitizing the woman to sexual taboos or social taboos. I mean, even introducing crime, petty theft or drug use, just keep introducing things that would be shocking at first and normalizing them. And then also surrounding her with other people, right? Reinforcing that. So it's not just the trafficker saying it, it's these new friends I've made. It's these other women who seem very glamorous and have money and they seem really cool. And they're all reinforcing the narrative that, committing these crimes is no big deal. Having sex with other people is no big deal. And even having sex for money is no big deal until really it's like a brainwashing process until that person completely sees the world differently. They'll start using different language. Like I said, there's that family dynamic. So now they're, like, for example, like this is very old school, although for street prostitution and street trafficking still used, but like anyone who's not in the life. So they would call what they do and their lifestyles the life. Anyone who doesn't do it's a square. So it just creates these group dynamics of like, we're family. We are very cool in the life. Everyone else is sort of lame, loser. They don't understand. They're square. And just this constant sort of, you wouldn't want to be, if you deviate or you push back, then you're going to get kind of embarrassed and shamed. Right. And so just continuously doing those things where they become very enmeshed in the group and they become very brainwashed. Their entire outlook on life becomes like a cult dynamic of how they see the world. And the life is you get the money, you engage in prostitution to get the money for the good of the family, for the good of the group. And you just, next thing you know, these women believe completely different things than they used to believe, right? And then talking about the online exploitation, it's unbelievable how rapid that grooming process can accelerate. So now we're seeing children, well, one, I would argue that the free access to pornography and sort of the social normalization of OnlyFans and things like that for this younger generation has almost started the grooming process for the traffickers. Kids are already sort of desensitized to participating in pornography, to sending nudes, to, hey, working on OnlyFans is something celebrities do. That's not sort of fringe thing. And every kid wants to be older and wants to be cool. So if it's completely normal and fine for celebrities and adults to do it, why wouldn't I do it? And just the Snapchat, all these kids have Snapchat, they're sending nudes to each other. That's the context that now if they meet someone online, usually these adults will pretend to be a peer, but they can very quickly and easily convince the child to send a nude image. And once they do that, then almost it's like done. It's like once they've got the child to send a nude image, they now have blackmail to extort this child. And, we represent two young men who they were on Snapchat at 13. They get a message from someone, send a picture pretending to be a 16-year-old girl, right? Name the high school that, I mean, these kids were in middle school, but like name the high school in their town, kind of built up this context to really make these kids believe she was 16-year-old and sent like a nude image to the boys. So now imagine like 13-year-old boys. I mean, what 13-year-old boy is not going to take the bait? It'd be very difficult I think this is where the education piece comes in, but like most 13-year-old boys are going to take that bait, right? I mean, that's just developmentally, that would be so challenging for them to navigate that situation. And so, of course, the children took the bait. They end up sending sexual images of themselves. And now it's revealed, oh, it's not a 16-year-old girl. It's some mysterious predatory adult. And he's extorting more and more extreme content and sends Facebook, hey, this is the Facebook profile of your baseball coach, isn't it? Hey, this is the Facebook profile of your pastor at your church, isn't it? If you don't, do these things, I'm going to send those nude images you sent to me to all these people. And that thought of embarrassment, that young age, is almost unimaginable. I mean, that seems like their life would be over. So they comply. And now that's the creation of child pornography. I mean, I would argue the trafficking has occurred, even though they never even met this predator in person. And then you see that the predator trades that child pornography, posts it online, monetizes it. And so again, that's continuous trafficking, in my opinion. We can get into the statute, but if you're commercializing sexual abuse, I would argue that's trafficking. And we see that happening. And, in our lawsuit, the content ended up on Twitter years later. So now these kids are in high school, and the young man almost killed himself because the entire high school is seeing this. It's getting hundreds of thousands of views on Twitter. He messages Twitter. Twitter asks for his ID, reviews his ID, reviews the content, and says, we're not taking it down.
Why?
Because we'll never know really why, but Twitter allows hardcore porn on their site. It was allowed as a matter of policy. So I don't know if they were missing the fact that this is a child, even though he specifically says he was a child, or what was going on, but they allow porn. And I think they were just like, well, too bad to this child. That's a federal crime, and obviously really hurt him. So, it's amazing how quickly trafficking can happen online.
Guys, if there's one thing that brings us all together, it's that we've all set health goals and failed miserably, whether it's weight loss or exercising more or eating better. But if you don't have a plan, it's not going to work out. That's where Prolon comes in. It's 5-day fasting, mimicking diet, gives you a science-backed, structured approach to stay on track and see real results. And now they're upping their game with the new next-gen 5-day program, delivering the same science-backed benefits in a cleaner, more convenient, and more flavorful format. And I know what you're thinking, fasting, that sounds hard. I was with you. I had done some of the more gimmicky things before, the juice cleanses and all that stuff. And I wasn't sure if I could even handle this. But that's why Prolon is so amazing, because it's not just fasting. It's fasting mimicking. It's actually giving you food to keep you going through those 5 days so you don't feel sluggish. You don't feel slow. In fact, by the end of it, you will feel better than you have ever felt before. I experienced it, and you will experience it too. Now is the time to try Prolon.
Prolon is a plant-based nutrition program featuring soups, snacks, and beverages designed to nourish your body and keeping it in a fasting state, triggering cellular rejuvenation and renewal. Next Gen builds on the original Prolon with 100% organic soups and teas and a richer taste and ready-to-eat meals. It's been developed over decades at USC's Longevity Institute and backed by top U.S. medical centers. Prolong has been shown to support biological age reduction, metabolic health, skin appearance, fat loss, and energy. You guys, we both did it, and it made us feel incredible, and you should see the results for yourself. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide, plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's prolonlife.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors. I just went through like a roller coaster of emotions because there's so many follow-up questions on all of these, but you're right. It sounds like everything you just described in terms of the grooming process online seems to be its own huge animal that we could probably have an entire interview on. But I see kind of two major buckets. One bucket, the traditional quote unquote, almost brainwashing cult-like behavior where someone plays the lover boy and makes a young, vulnerable, say foster child girl fall in love with him, and she does things seemingly willingly. Obviously, if you're minor, there's absolutely no consent, but I can see where the line begins to be a little bit blurred if that person doesn't view herself as a victim, doesn't view her trafficker as a criminal, does things in her mind willingly and with consent because she quote unquote loves this man. And
and the thing is, if this child has been sexually abused by like every adult in their life, and even just facing neglect and abuse by every adult in their life, in her mind, okay, you say I shouldn't have sex with an adult, and he's pimping me out, but he's still nicer to me and provided for me more than any other adult in my life, and that's what she thinks or believes, and it unfortunately might even be the case.
It's still a better life than maybe the other abuse that she sees, because it may still be horrible, but she maybe gets like nice jewelry out of it instead of before, which is nothing. And I can see how that set of victims, I mean, as devastating as that is, difficult for them to get out of it because they never see themselves as a victim. And I want to come back to that, how you're able to, I want to talk about your specific work of getting through to those women, because they have to really self-identify and come forward in order to point fingers at their, whoever is exploiting them. But then the online thing, oh my goodness, with the blackmail, that sounds slightly different in the sense that there's not the same, I'm doing this because I love you, but rather it is straight blackmail. Like we've heard of revenge porn. We've heard of, that typically happens between two people who know each other. But this sounds like just absolute internet predation by someone they may never have met. And that's interesting because we've thought traditionally about sex trafficking as a person with a face, but here it could very well be someone you never meet, and yet using the interstate wires in terms of like having a federal hook, they're using those tools to be able to control someone without any physical control, which is a whole new world of terribleness.
And it can happen. I mean, there's a state representative from South Carolina whose son was an All-American, football player, popular, happy-go-lucky kid that could possibly be. He's like 16. He goes to bed at night and gets in a similar type of exchange where thinks he's talking to a girl, sends a nude image, and starts getting blackmailed for money, like you said, on reputational, I'll send this to everyone you know. He committed suicide that night.
Oh my goodness.
The parents put their happy son with his life ahead of him to bed and woke up to him gone. That's how quickly that can happen. And I believe that the individuals who did that were doing this from another country. I think they were in Africa, and they had done this to tons of kids. It's crazy.
So that's, you're right. And unfortunately, I've known people in my life who have fallen, and it happens within like hours. Truly, it can happen overnight. As you said, that is not an exaggeration. But what is the end game for these traffickers?
Yeah.
Is it to get sex? Is it just money? What is the end game? Because with every crime, typically it's easy to say, oh, you rob a bank because you're trying to get money. Right. Oh, you carjack to get the car. But what is the end game of sex trafficking?
Well, I don't think you can answer that easily because there's all these different modes. We're already kind of identifying. I think the profile of a trafficker who trafficking women to street prostitution and their goals and motivators are very different than sort of this online sextortion scheme. So I think there's different motivations, but there's patterns again. This online extortion scheme is becoming such a rapid pandemic, and especially typically victims are women, majority women and girls, with obviously there's always been young boy and adult. Even the rare adult male victim, there's always a small percentage of them. But with this online extortion, there's been this spike in male victims. So some of the studies and research have showed that when the child is a male victim targeted by this extortion scheme, usually the motivating factor is to get money. So usually they are extorting that child for money. getting them to transfer whatever, this and that. And, you know, even if it's just a couple $100, they're have so many victims. I mean, they're doing a volume game where they're just messaging. You now have someone who potentially with social media has access to virtually any child. So, I mean, they're just reaching out to all kinds of kids on social media and getting hundreds, if not thousands of victims. And they're happy to get $100 out of each of these children. So you have children committing suicide over this guy. All he cared about was maybe $100. I mean, that's how disturbing it is. But there's also the motivating factor of getting more CSAM. And that is often when the target victim is a female child. Often it's just getting the content, because if they get the content, they can monetize that. And also, there is a currency in child pornography itself. I mean, we call it child sexual abuse materials, CSAM, but CSAM itself is a currency because in the pedophile rings, they can't process payment and they don't want to leave a trail of purchasing things. So it's just a trade. You can get CSAM if you're willing to trade CSAM. And that's also how they keep law enforcement out of the stings, because law enforcement is not going to start distributing CSAM. So they create these closed groups where to enter the group, you have to provide CSAM. And if you do that crime, you commit the crime of providing CSAM, you get admitted to the group and you get access to more CSAM. So, you know, that's kind of a broad view of some of the motivating factors of the online scape. But then, you know, of course, if it's in person, usually it's about money. It's not about sex. Usually these traffickers, a lot of times they were involved in drug trafficking. And that was becoming way more high risk than sex trafficking, where, to your point, you often have not compliant victims who are not willing to cooperate. And it's not so easy as just, if we get the victim, we're going to have the crime. Like if we get the drugs, the evidence is there. It's not as simple as that. And if you have a couple women, you can sell them dozens of times a day. And you don't have to constantly keep sourcing and putting yourself at risk of getting these illegal drugs or things like that, or illegal guns or whatever it is. So that's usually the factor. And it's interesting, you know, we talked about the Andrew Tate case. We can talk about this more later, but in videos, you know, he would say things. I mean, he did courses teaching other men his methods. I mean, he said things like, I have sex. I don't even want to have sex with these girls. Like I can get sex whenever I want. And at this point, like I'm only having sex with the women to control them. Like I don't even enjoy it anymore. I'm not having sex to have sex. I'm having sex so I can control her so that she can make me money. You know, he said things very similar to that. So yeah, I think that's the motivating factor for the majority of traffickers.
Wow. I had never thought about that child abuse material being the currency itself. That makes complete sense in terms of, I knew that they traded it, but I had never used that language as currency before. And that is so helpful to view it as currency, to see just how pernicious and how insular this group is, because you're right, law enforcement can't share it. Right. And usually it has to be like original, right? You can't just pull it from a website. You have to show.
They're very tuned in. Like they have, I mean, it's sick, but they have cataloged all kinds of CSAM, and they very much like check if it's new, and as sick as that is. Like
unfortunately, I think AI helps them be able to identify if it is in fact original. And unfortunately, AI is going to help them identify, and they want real abuse material. And what they do is they have to hunt down unwitting minors in order to do this, which is then you have the child abuse behind the actual CSAM that's then distributed, which is horrific. Okay, now that all of us are terrified to go outside of our houses or go on the internet, you are not a prosecutor. And we typically talk about, you know, the prosecutors working for some sort of a governmental agency going after criminal actors. What do you do, and how do you help victims basically fight back against this? Because it seems like a dam has just been, you know, burst open with the advent of the internet and all of these websites that allow very hardcore porn or child abuse materials to be on their websites. What do you do specifically to fight back in this area?
Yeah. So at my organization, so it's the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. We call it NACOSI for short. So at NACOSI, I mean, we're advocates. We have a research department. We put out research and stats to educate people, to do advocacy. We also do a lot of policy. So we want to change laws to improve this situation. And then we have our law center, which I'm the director of the law center. And in that, obviously, we are advising on policy too, but we are also representing victims in strategic civil litigation. So often there's only so much that prosecutors can do, right? Resources are limited. There's evidence that, as you said, this exploitation problem has exploded online to such a degree that DOJ, for example, has to prioritize 2 and under violent assaults because they quite literally couldn't investigate every truly valid report that comes in. If there's a active missing child that they could potentially rescue, that's going to be number one priority. And then these, 2 and under violent assault. So imagine if you're the 12 or 14-year-old that gets reported, you're just sitting in line. I mean, there's just literally not enough law enforcement agents and prosecutors available to investigate that case many times if they don't have a lot of information to go on, as I'm sure you know.
I'll just confirm that. Unfortunately, that's correct. I don't want to tell any potential bad actors that that's the case, but we've said this before, that there are not enough law enforcement officers to investigate, not enough prosecutors, because it is so widespread, as what you've said lets us know. And so this is fascinating. So you go from the civil route in order to hurt them. Civil being typically money, right? And money hurts, especially if that's their currency.
Yeah. And, civil litigation kind of gets a bad rap. Sometimes people think of like the slip and fall lawyers and see that as being maybe kind of exploitive at times. And I don't even know if it is, because the only kind of civil litigation I do would be through this trafficking statute. And we view it, as an advocacy organization, we view it as such an important tool for justice, because often also, as I'm sure you know, prosecutors are faced with such an extremely high burden that they can truly believe this victim and believe this crime occurred and have to decline the case because the chance of meeting that standard is too low. And honestly, it wouldn't be healthy for the victim to go through this whole criminal process only for this person to be acquitted. And then that would empower that predator potentially, right? So this avenue, the civil justice system, we think it's so important because it puts the power in the hands of the individual to hold accountable those that have harmed them. And particular for trafficking, Congress specifically passed civil remedies for trafficking victims so that they could sue their perpetrators and also financial beneficiaries. And this is where, from my organization's point of view, we're interested in massive societal change. That is our goal. There's a lot of good law firms out there doing this work to sue each individual trafficker, and they should be as empowered to do that. We try to pick strategic litigation that we think will have the biggest impact on society. And particularly, we want to target those companies. I mean, from our perspective, the internet has exploded and exacerbated this problem for some very specific reasons. One, we think there's some policy problems, which, for example, there's a federal law called CDA 230, Section 230. It's the Communications Decency Act, which was passed in 1996, literally to protect kids. I mean, you can hear in the word decency. I mean, that's how old it is. It was to protect kids literally from being exposed to inappropriate content online. And the burgeoning tech industry was throwing up this big flag saying, there's this case out in New York where the website was held accountable for defamation and that whole website had to shut down. And is that what you're going to do to us? There'll be no internet if we're going to face lawsuits for everything everyone does. So to sort of strike a deal with the burgeoning tech industry, Congress put in this Section 230, which essentially says, a website's not going to be responsible for all third-party conduct. But it also specifically says, they're going to get this protection because they're good Samaritans. It's actually called the title of it is Good Samaritan. We're supposed to encourage platforms to voluntarily do the right things and try and keep their platforms safe. And then they wouldn't have to face liability. But the opposite has happened. Most people know, right? Everyone knows the internet's crazy. Internet's Wild West. You can do anything on the internet, but no one knows why. It's because of that law.
I mean, you've noted 2 examples. The minor who asked Twitter to take down the child abuse material said no, but Twitter is not held accountable for having child abuse material. And you also said Pornhub, that says, well, I mean, I think we all know YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, those are all just some of the platforms that you've probably seen things on there that you're like, that's absolutely false, or wow, how is that allowed on there? And obviously, if Instagram were sued for it, they wouldn't have it up there.
Well, and if you just think about any product, right? If you cars, right? They have to deal with liability, right? Everything they do, they're having to factor in safety. And that's not because they're saints who care so much about their customers, okay? That's because they're constantly doing a risk evaluation. And it is good and incentivizes safe products. You need liability to force companies to spend money on safety, because to make these products safe, it's going to cost money. And the truth is, not a single tech company is ever going to spend one single dime reducing engagement and implementing safety features, both of which will cost massive amounts of money, if they could never be held liable for any harm that's caused. And that's what we've seen. Twitter alleged that they had immunity for what happened with our client, and the court said yes. And the Ninth Circuit is reviewing that now. But I mean, it's not looking good. The Ninth Circuit just said Grindr, for example, is off the hook for matching adults with children. And it resulted in terrible exploitation of the child. And they just said, well, even though that's your tool, even though your tool did that, third-party content, I guess. These courts just don't want to hold them accountable. So we see this litigation as, one, a tool for those survivors who maybe could not get the justice that they deserved. And second, we really think it motivates societal change. I think we see that with tobacco, the tobacco industry. We would all still be having to deal with cigarette smokes in airplanes, truly, if they hadn't had to face liability and the discovery process.
Yeah. And for those of you who are not familiar with this CDA Section 230 debate, it is a very hotly contested area. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion about movement, whether to reform it or to repeal it, really on both sides of the aisle for a long time. And I think, with the kinds of cases you guys are bringing, it certainly sheds light on the harm it can do. But also just to note that, like, 1996, I was alive in 1996. I was definitely not using the internet in the form that it is today, right? And that's just the way legislation works. It works very slowly for a reason. We have slow moving democracy. It's supposed to protect fast changes, but guess what? Evolves very quickly, the internet. And so this is going to be very interesting to see what happens. For those of you who want to know more about it, there's so much to read about it. It sounds like Dani Nkosi is putting out information about it as well. And we can always post it for people who are interested in hearing more about it. But let me ask this. So there are these civil statutes that you're able to sue under. And without getting into the nitty gritty, it's not that it's a lower standard, but rather it's able to hold specific people accountable. Do you find that you're able to be successful in those civil lawsuits generally, or are these traffickers able to evade liability if they have good enough lawyers, or if the facts are with them, or something like that?
No, it's still extremely, extremely difficult. I said a lower standard. I mean, slightly lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's still a very high standard and many elements to prove. And there's there's a lot of factors. There's, if this trafficker is wealthy and can pay for unbelievably powerful, prestigious law firm, that can make it almost impossible. We see that with Pornhub. Despite all of the information coming out constantly from every direction, they have made litigating against them as expensive and as difficult as possible. I mean, if we didn't have literally a team of law firms who are willing to just go for this because it's the right thing, and that's what people don't realize, they're investing and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars that they may never get back. This client is indigent. These clients are indigent. They don't have money. They're not paying. These lawyers are just having to invest that money in the hopes that they win. And truly, every single one of the lawyers working on this case is doing it because it's just the right thing. And if their law firm loses out, they know they did the right thing. I mean, that's really unbelievable. I think they're heroes, but it's been going on for years. I mean, I think we first filed the lawsuit in 2021. We're now at 2025. We're still not at trial, right? Because they could do all kinds of things to delay and drag out, and even processing the documents. I mean, when they finally are having to force to provide information and discovery, we'll just provide 100,000 pages of documents that you literally will have to pay an unbelievable...
Just to host the documents itself costs a lot of money.
You literally have to purchase something to host it, and also a product so that you can search it, so you can process it. I mean, that costs thousands of dollars a month. It's just unbelievable what they can do. And then you have like the Tate brothers will just sue every single person who says anything about them. And
let's talk about that. This is really interesting because, okay, so the Tate brothers, if you haven't been keeping up with the news, they are brothers who came online, built an online business, basically, I think selling a brand of masculinity. And it was mostly masculinity at first, but then there were allegations of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking using, I believe, OnlyFans. And they weren't charged in the United States. I believe it was only in Romania at the time, but they are Americans and they were briefly here in Florida, but I believe they just left Florida to go check in Romania. But your client, who is a Jane Doe, did not bring a lawsuit against them in the first instance. Rather, she was sued for defamation for testifying against them for her experience of being sexually exploited by them. So now, we're there now. And I know this is a very live situation for you. And I can't believe you even have time to come talk to us. But can you tell us a little bit about this case and how litigation is being used as a tool to silence victims?
Yes. And, they're not, I'll just start by saying this is not unique to the Tates. Like Peter Nygaard, who's being prosecuted for trafficking, he was a fashion mogul. He famously sued or threatened to sue anyone who, made allegations against him. We see there's another lawsuit actually against Nick Carter from the Backstreet Boys. There's several lawsuits alleging that he abused minors. He's tried to sue them for defamation because the truth is having to even defend yourself is so costly. It's so costly that if you don't have the money, how can you do it? I mean, it's difficult to even find lawyers willing to represent you. It is going to expose you to this process of digging into your personal life, all of these things that most people would just say, this is not worth the headache. Like, really, I'm going to have to endure years and maybe go bankrupt or have not even maybe have pro bono legal counsel. Like, what can I do against this kind of attack? And so it's very effective, and it's not unique to the Tate brothers. But, it's interesting because I think a lot of people, they have an unbelievable following, the Tate brothers, particularly with young men, even, minor boys, like very young teenage boys, really, really love them. But a lot of people in America, particularly people over 35, I would say, hadn't even heard of them. So it's a fascinating sort of dichotomy that they could have 10 million followers on Twitter, yet a lot of people in America had never heard of them. And, it's interesting because you mentioned their sort of masculine influencing, but they have said repeatedly on interviews that they made their first $1 million doing this webcam modeling. So they were poor. He was like a kickboxer. They didn't have any money. And he said, I sat in a room and said, what assets do I have? I have hot girlfriends. I'll put them on webcam. And so he then boasted about eventually having a webcam empire. He said that he at one time managed 75 women across multiple locations. And then he sold courses and did tons of interviews, like on podcasts and things, talking about how he got this money, this millions of dollars, because he was being very flashy with the lifestyle, showing the supercars, luxury items, that kind of thing. So that's sort of, he actually built his influencer persona off of being, as he has described himself, a webcam pimp. So he's called himself a pimp many times, and he would describe his techniques. And even his own description of those techniques are that I would meet a girl, get her to fall in love with me, and then get her on webcam and convince her to give all the money to me. That's his own description of how he ran his webcam business. And then once he was able to, and he did all these shock value videos. I mean, those videos, he was teaching men, encouraging other men to do this. So they were seeking him out for that advice. There was an entire BBC documentary about this community of men who were all convincing their girlfriends to go on webcam and discussing it with Andrew Tate. And they're posting trophy images of their girls doing this and talking about that. And then it just kept spinning off into just more and more, I would say, like vanilla masculinity content. Like you said, he's very good at, tying into the political issues of the time and speaking, common sense or to a group that, he's very charismatic, very good at social media. And so then he just started he had kind of built this base of following, but then he could do these sort of very flashy clickbaity videos on just general topics. But the truth is, like, his webcam is what made him relevant in the first place, fascinatingly.
I think you just totally proved the point. I am absolutely over 35. And you're right. I had it mixed up. I thought he was just an influencer because we have a lot of these like Hollywood types who all of a sudden this famous director is now, there are allegations of sexual exploitation or, sexual misconduct. And we're all shocked because, oh, there's such a, stalwart in their arena. But I had it mixed up that they became an influencer from the webcam business, which is fascinating.
And that's their narrative. And I mean, they have the money to do the PR to do that, but they say, oh, I'm rich and famous now. Here are the allegations. But the reality is women have been reporting them from the get-go. There was women reporting, I think 3 women in the UK. His webcam business started in the UK and then it moved to Romania, Romania is like well known as an international hotspot of this webcam industry. But he started in the UK, and in 2015, women were making allegations that he was being sexually violent and describing what seems like trafficking, that they were being forced to do this webcam stuff and give him all the money. And he was very violent and very abusive. So those women waited for 4 years to then the law enforcement did their investigation, recommended it for prosecution, only to have the CPS kind of sit on it. The Tates leave the UK, and then they just kind of decided not to prosecute. But now those women never got justice, and we see all these allegations coming now from Romania. And fascinatingly, the UK also, you mentioned that there's this prosecution happening in Romania. I can talk a little bit about that. But there's also an open investigation in the UK. They're actively pursuing criminal charges against them and got an extradition order from Romania that when that criminal case is done, he should be extradited to the UK to face criminal charges. And the date range for those victims, because it's an entirely different set of victims than the women from 2015, these victims are alleging abuse that occurred from the period of 2012 to 2015. And what's, consistent among all these victims, each describe being choked. Some even describe being choked until they go unconscious. So you have these UK women, and those women whose case was not prosecuted, they brought civil claims. So there's an active civil case that they're pursuing. They've alleged that Andrew Tate strangled them till they went unconscious sometimes. Some of them, their blood vessels burst in their eyes. Now we fast forward to the Romanian prosecution, which includes now over 35 women, including 2 minors. One of the minors' victim testimony, she alleged that she was strangled until she went unconscious as a 15-year-old at the hands of Andrew Tate. She doesn't even speak English. She doesn't know these women in the UK, yet they're reporting the same kind of activity. And this is sort of breaking news, but it was just reported by TMZ that when Andrew Tate came to America, as you mentioned, when he was in California, the girl he was seeing at the time has now allegedly filed a police report that Andrew Tate strangled her while he was in California. And she took pictures of the bruises, allegedly shared some abusive text messages, and has filed a police report now, I believe, in California. So you have, again, like this very consistent victim statement about what they're experiencing, which is, I think you could probably chime in that that's usually a very credible sign that these allegations are true when you see consistency among victims who don't even know each other.
I promised you that we would keep this interview within 45 minutes, and I've already clearly gone over because there are just so many things that you have enlightened us about, and I don't want to keep you all night, but you're right. This investigation and the many allegations against the Tate brothers continues. It's a case, if you guys are interested in seeing kind of sexual exploitation, sex trafficking types of cases progress in real time internationally. And we haven't even touched on the domestic versus the international sexual exploitation that happens. That's something you can certainly follow, I think, in the news. And you are representing one of the Jane Does. Unfortunately, it sounds like there are lots of women who have been victimized by them. So we'll be following that case certainly, and very interested to see how it goes. But I would be remiss to let you go without asking you, I think, a very important question. This is going to be twofold, and you can answer it however you'd like. First, if you are a woman or a man who falls into something that you just described as a victim, and you may not even know it yourself, and you're beginning to see maybe the light, maybe through this interview, maybe from people who are close to you trying to show you the brainwashing and the control that someone else has over you, what can you do? Where do you go seek help? And secondarily, if you see it in someone else, whether it's even just in passing, you don't know them well, or someone you do know well, what can you do to try and help when they may not see themselves as victims?
Yeah, so this is really important. I'm glad you're asking this for your listeners and anyone out there. To the first part of your question, the person who maybe is starting to feel like they're in a bad situation. One, it's not healthy if you are in a relationship that doesn't allow you relationships with other people. So if there's constantly a fight about spending time with your friends or your family, and you can see there's really not a good reason for that. I mean, I'm sure this person's coming up with reasons, but if those friends and family members have always been good friends and family members to you, and this relationship is preventing you from having contact with them, that's a really bad sign. That's a red flag. And so I think the first thing I would do is really attempt to spend time with someone outside of the situation you're in, if you can do that safely. Obviously, if you're actually feeling like your life might be in danger, call the human trafficking hotline, call 911, or if you want to reach out to us, to our organization, we can help you. A lawyer can help you. Sometimes it's a good idea just to get legal counsel and get their advice and have them help you navigate through the situation. They can even help you navigate speaking to the police. That's not always cost effective, but at the same time, there's options out there and people that are willing to do it pro bono. Again, we could refer you to that. There's a group called the Joseph Project, which specifically provides pro bono legal counsel to survivors. So you could reach out to them. If you are the person that sees maybe some signs that you think your friend is in a bad situation, the first thing I want to say is they're not going to respond positively to probably anything you say, especially the first time. And don't be discouraged by that. Don't be discouraged by that. There's a lot of evidence that even in the trafficking situation, which we kind of talked about, Alice, they don't identify as victims. I mean, I think there's some statistics that it takes like 6 or 7 times of leaving before the survivor can really leave. And I think that there's a very similar corollary to anyone in an abusive relationship. They're going to be defensive. The first time they're challenged, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, and be just very patient and gentle with them, but also just be honest. Just say, and you can be very kind and loving, and don't let them create distance because they're going to try and do that. Be like, I'm your friend. I care about you. Listen, I respect you and your decisions, but I'm seeing this. I'm concerned about this. And then if they're getting defensive, let it go. But then another time, particularly if there's an incident, a particular incident you could point to, and you could say, listen, I trust you and I respect you, but I'm observing this. This seems a little off to me. This seems like concerning to me. What do you think about that? Just keep doing that and just making sure they know you're there and you'll always love them. Even if they cut you off, let them know they can always come back to you, because next thing you know, they will. And the most powerful tool against the trafficker is for the victim to have a place to go, truly. If a trafficker and abuser is the victim has someone to go to for help. So just make it clear that you are that person, however you can do that in a really constructive way, I think would be my advice.
Thank you so much for all of those resources. We will post those phone numbers. We will post those websites for you guys on our show notes so that you can have easy access to them, or you can send them to someone who may need them. Dani, we could talk for probably hours longer, and I am so thankful for you coming on here and talking about this, because oftentimes we cover these cases once it's already happened. We're looking at it from a true crime perspective. But what I've learned tonight and what I've learned from prosecuting these types of cases is that this is probably one of the most pervasive ways of criminal conduct that we are all susceptible to. Yes, there are vulnerable populations, but because of the advent of the internet, look around you. There is probably someone being groomed. But for someone who cared reaching out to stop that grooming, they could then be the next story on the news. And so this is not meant to scare, but it is meant to open up our eyes that this is a very real criminal reality in our life, but there are ways out of it. And there are heroes like Dani and Nkosi who are doing everything they can to fight it. And there are resources for you. So if this is you or someone there are resources. If you forget everything that's been said tonight, send an email to prosecutorspod@gmail.com. We will direct you to these resources again. And this has been so enlightening, Dani. Before I let you go, is there anything else you'd like to add? We've covered legislation. We've covered, TMZ. We've covered Pornhub. This has been one of the most wide-ranging interviews and one of the most interesting interviews I've had. But is there anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
Well, thank you so much. I've absolutely loved talking with you. I could definitely talk with you for hours. I'll just say, please go to our website because we have so many resources there. Any of the things we just talked about, we probably have an entire webpage full of information about it. So it's endsexualexploitation.org. Come visit us, come check us out, and please support us. We're a nonprofit and we depend on generous donations from people who care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dani. Thank you for the work you do and for so many who do this work, whether it's pro bono lawyers to people in the nonprofit world. It sounds like there's a lot more work to be done, and we hope to be a part of it. Thank you. You guys, let us know what you think. You can email at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. You can check us out on all the social media platforms that we just talked about that may also have some harmful content, but we're also there, so it's not all bad. But until next time, I'm Alice, and this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. About the ads, I'm like, I don't even control them.
You should be happy. You should be happy that the podcast you listen
it means
to
the
has
podcast will
ads.
keep going.
But yeah, because guess what? Probably eventually we'd get tired of just doing this for free. Maybe not.
Well, I was going to say maybe eventually
but
I will get a closet of my own.
But it's like, I love doing this. Don't get me wrong. But I have 3 kids.
But there are pulls on our time.
Kids. There are other things we could be doing than this.
How do we have so many kids?
But it's nice to be able to say
podcast
to Miss
4
Brett,
kids ago.
Mrs. Brett, we actually make a little money on this, so maybe we should keep doing it. And she's like, okay, fine.
Are you looking for your next case? Pluto TV has all your favorite crime dramas streaming for free.
You're gonna need some backup.
Which means suspense is free.
Very cool.
Watch CSI New York, Criminal Minds, Blue Bloods, Tracker, FBI, and SWAT all for free.
You can't outrun this.
Someone is gonna pay for all this crime. But it's not gonna be you.
Take care of business, fellas.
Watch all the cases, all for free, from all your favorite devices.
We got you.
Feel the free. Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.